The toothbrush had lost most of its bristles 3 months ago. Ren Ashby knew this because she had been the one using it not on her teeth, but on the grout lines between the bathroom tiles on the third floor of Harrow House, working in small circles the way Mrs. Voss had shown her when she was 6 years old and had first been assigned cleaning duties. The bleach water was cold. It was always cold up here. The radiator in the third-floor bathroom had not worked since February, and November in Portland, Maine did not negotiate with broken radiators. She was 18 years old today. The state of Maine had sent a letter. It was folded on the floor beside her knee because there was nowhere else to put it. No desk in the bathroom, no pocket in the dress she was wearing, which had belonged to at least 3 other girls before her and hung from her thin shoulders like something that had given up trying to fit in anyone properly. The letter said in the careful language of institutions that deliver difficult news in passive constructions that her status as a ward of the state would conclude on the date of her 18th birthday. It said she was encouraged to pursue available resources. It said the staff at Harrow House wished her well in her future endeavors. It did not say where she was supposed to go. Wren dipped the toothbrush into the gray water and kept scrubbing. She had learned over 16 years in this building that the best response to most things was to keep working. If you worked hard enough, if you made yourself useful enough, if you scrubbed the grout clean enough, they might let you stay a little longer. She had no illusions about this being kindness on their part. It was economics. The building needed to be maintained, and Wren was very good at maintaining things. Under the cot in the basement, wedged between the water heater and a stack of donated mattresses that smelled of other people's decades, she had a cardboard box. Inside it were the complete material facts of her existence. 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans that fit one photograph of her mother, a library card, and a stack of college scholarship applications she had been filling out by flashlight for the past 4 months, using a pencil because she had run out of pens in September and had not been able to replace them. The photograph was the thing she had looked at most in 16 years. It showed a young woman with dark hair, beautiful in the particular way of people who are laughing at something just beyond the frame of the picture, their whole face alive with a joy that the camera has caught at exactly the right moment. The woman was holding a baby. The baby was Wren, though she had no memory of being held by anyone, and the photograph was the only evidence that it had ever happened. Her mother's name, according to the records at Harrow House, was Sylvie Ashby. She had died in 2008 when Wren was 2 years old in a car accident on a coastal road north of Portland. The brakes had failed. The investigating officers had ruled it mechanical failure. The insurance company had paid out a modest sum that had been absorbed by the administrative costs of placing Wren in state care, and Sylvie Ashby had been filed away in the category of young women who died too soon for reasons that no one questioned hard enough. Wren had questioned it for 16 years. She had no evidence. She had only the feeling that a woman who laughed the way her mother laughed in that photograph was not the kind of woman whose brakes failed conveniently on a road she drove every week. The bathroom door opened. Mrs. Alara Voss stood in the doorway. She was 60 years old, gray-haired, built like someone who had spent 4 decades absorbing other people's difficulties and had grown solid with them. Wren had known her face for as long as she had known any face. In 16 years, she had seen it in many configurations, tired, disappointed occasionally, kind, frequently impatient. She had never seen it the way it looked right now. Mrs. Voss was afraid. "Downstairs," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "Now, wash your hands first." Wren looked at her for one long moment. Then she stood, pulled off her rubber gloves, and ran her hands under the cold tap until the bleach smell faded. She followed Mrs. Voss down the creaking stairs without asking why, because in 16 years she had learned that the information she needed always revealed itself faster if she waited for it, rather than reaching for it. The foyer of Harrow House had not changed since the building was established in the 1970s. The same wallpaper peeled at its corners. The same bare bulb cast the same unflattering light across the same cracked linoleum. The portrait of the facility's founder hung above the entrance, a woman with a stern face and determined eyes who had believed in the rehabilitation of difficult circumstances through rigorous routine. Wren had spent 16 years walking beneath that portrait, and she had come to think of it as a fair description of her own childhood, rigorous routine, and largely devoid of warmth. But today there was something in the foyer that did not belong to it. A man, tall, silver-haired, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of posture that is not natural, but learned the posture of someone who was taught at considerable expense. that how you hold your body communicates what you think of yourself and what you expect from other people. His suit was charcoal gray, cut with the precision of something made by hand for a specific body rather than manufactured for a general one. His shoes reflected the dim light of the foyer bulb. In one hand, he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Harrow House spent on food in a month. He turned when Wren reached the bottom of the stairs. His eyes moved over her. The dress, the chapped hands, the rubber band holding her hair back found on the sidewalk outside the library 3 weeks ago. He took an inventory of her in about 4 seconds, the way a person takes inventory of a situation they have been sent to assess. And then something interesting happened. He did not look at her with pity. Everyone who came to Harrow House looked at the children with pity, or with a kind of grateful relief, the relief of people who have narrowly avoided a fate and need to visit it occasionally to remind themselves of their own luck. This man looked at Wren the way a person looks at a problem they have been professionally engaged to solve. "Miss Wren Ashby," he said, not a question, a confirmation. "Yes. My name is Sterling Price. I'm the senior partner at Price & Harmon, an estate law firm based in Boston. I represent the estate of Aldrich Crestwood." He paused. "Mr. Crestwood passed away 9 days ago." The name meant nothing to her. She glanced at Mrs. Voss, who had pressed herself against the wall beside the staircase, with her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. "I'm sorry," Wren said. "I don't know who that is." Sterling Price reached into his briefcase. He withdrew a photograph. Old, its edges softened with age. The image slightly faded in the way of photographs that had been handled frequently by someone who found them worth handling. He held it out to her. Wren took it. The woman in the photograph was her mother. She knew this immediately, the way you know things you have been looking at your entire life. The dark hair, the particular quality of the smile. But this was a different angle than the photograph she kept in her cardboard box. This version showed more of the scene, a wider frame, more of the world her mother had been standing in when someone pointed a camera at her. And standing beside her mother, one hand resting on her shoulder with a weight that suggested protection rather than affection, was an old man. His face was angular and difficult, the face of someone who had made a great many decisions and had not always made the right ones, and had lived with this knowledge long enough that it had carved itself into his features. But his eyes, looking at the young woman beside him, held something that Wren recognized despite never having seen it directed at herself. He loved her. "That is your mother," Sterling Price said quietly. "Sylvie Crestwood. She changed her name to Sylvie Ashby when she left home. The man beside her is your grandfather, Aldrich Crestwood. He passed away 9 days ago. You are named in his will, Miss Ashby. The reading is this afternoon." Wren looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Sterling Price. She looked at the particular smoothness of his expression, controlled professional offering, exactly the right amount of gravity for the occasion. She thought about the way he had taken inventory of her in 4 seconds. She thought about the fact that he had answers ready before she had asked the questions. She noted all of this and said nothing about it. "I'll need to get my coat," she said. The car was a black Mercedes with tinted windows and leather seats the color of good soil. Wren sat in the back and watched Maine dissolve outside the window. The harbor district of Portland giving way to Route 1. Route 1 giving way to the private roads of the coast. The private roads giving way to tree lines so dense and old, they seemed less like landscaping and more like something the land had grown deliberately to discourage strangers. Price sat in the front passenger seat. A driver Wren was not introduced to handled the car with the quiet efficiency of someone paid well to be invisible. "Your grandfather founded Crestwood Maritime in 1972, Price said. He had been silent for most of the drive, which Wren had used to look out the window and think. When he spoke, he did not turn around. He was 26 years old. He started with 2 cargo vessels operating out of Portland Harbor. By the time your mother was born, the company had become one of the largest shipping enterprises on the eastern seaboard." "Why did my mother leave?" Wren asked. The question had been pressing against the inside of her chest since the moment Price had shown her the photograph. 16 years of the same question asked of social workers and intake forms in the portrait of the founder of Harrow House, all of them unable to answer it. Now there was a living person in the car who might know, and she asked it without apology. Price was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was a difficult man," he said finally. "He believed in family loyalty. He believed that meant certain things." Another pause. Your mother had her own beliefs about how she wanted to live her life. When she was 22, she left. She took nothing with her except her clothing. She left pregnant, Wren said. Yes. And my grandfather never looked for her. The estrangement was significant. That's not what I asked. Price's silence was its own answer. Wren looked back out the window. She was building a picture the way she had always built pictures of things she needed to understand, not from what people told her, but from the shape of what they left out. Price had told her that Aldrich Crestwood had founded a shipping empire and that her mother had left under difficult circumstances. He had not explained why a man who had not searched for his daughter in 18 years had now named his granddaughter in his will. He had not explained why he himself seemed to know exactly where to find a girl that the state of Maine had been unable to connect to any living relatives for 16 years. She filed these questions away and watched the coastline appear through the trees. The estates emerged from the forest, gradually massive houses, set back from the road behind iron gates and stone pillars carved with family names. Old money in its most literal architectural form, the money of families who had owned the same land long enough that the land had absorbed the ownership and given it back as permanence. And then the trees ended, and Wren saw Crestwood Bluff for the first time. It rose from the cliff face the way something geological rises, not built so much as erupted, as though the granite of the Maine coast had pushed it upward over centuries. Stone walls, the gray blue of deep water. Windows that multiplied across the facade in irregular rows, each one dark, each one watching. Towers at the corners. Chimneys reaching into a sky that had gone the color of pewter in the November afternoon. And behind it, barely visible through the mist that perpetually haunted this section of coastline, the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the rocks far below. It was not a house. It was a statement about what money could insist upon when it had been accumulating long enough. Your grandfather built it in 1982, Price said. It has been the family home ever since. Wren said nothing. She was looking at the windows, counting them, noting which ones showed any light and which ones did not. Old habits. In Harrow House, you learned quickly which rooms were safe and which were not, and the way you learned was by watching the light. None of the windows at Crestwood Bluff were lit. The interior was everything the exterior had promised, and more. Wren followed Price through an entrance hall that could have contained the entire ground floor of Harrow House, her worn shoes silent on marble floors that had been polished to a mirror. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, unlit in the afternoon. Oil portraits lined the walls, men and women, with the same angular jaw, the same eyes that held authority as a default expression. Her ancestors, people who shared her blood and had never known she existed. She did not look at them with longing. She looked at them the way she looked at everything in new environments, cataloging, assessing, building the map she would need later. Price led her through a corridor and stopped before a set of double doors carved with the image of a ship fighting through a heavy sea. He put his hand on the brass handle and paused. Before we go in, he said, his voice dropping to something that presented itself as confidence. There are things you should know. Your grandfather had one other child, a daughter named Vivian. She is still living along with her husband and her son. They were present during the preparation of the will. They were expecting to be the primary beneficiaries of the estate. And they're not, Wren said. Price's expression did not change. The will contains provisions they were not anticipating. I want you to be prepared. The next hour may be difficult. He opened the doors. The library beyond was large in the way of rooms designed to communicate something about the person who occupied them, the shelves running floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that carried the particular smell of books too valuable to read. The stone fireplace large enough to stand inside the Persian rugs, absorbing the sound of footsteps in a way that made the room feel sealed from the world outside. A fire burned in the hearth. Before it, on leather furniture arranged with the precision of people who had been waiting long enough to rearrange themselves several times, sat three people who turned to look at Wren when she entered. The woman was the first thing you noticed. She was in her early 50s, blonde hair drawn back so severely it seemed to pull the skin of her face, taut diamonds at her throat and ears, and fingers that caught the firelight and threw it back. She wore black from collar to hem, but it was not mourning. Mourning is soft. This was armor. Beside her, a man in his late 50s with the quality of someone who had once been physically imposing and had gone soft with years of not needing to be. His silver hair was disheveled in a way that might have been grief or might have been something he had stopped managing long ago. He held his phone in both hands and barely looked up when Wren entered. In a chair by the window, one leg thrown over the arm, with the casual arrogance of a man who has never been told that a room might not accommodate his comfort, sat a young man of about 23. Dark-haired, handsome in a way that would have been more appealing without the expression he was wearing, a smirk that had settled so permanently into his features it seemed less like an emotion and more like a structural element of his face. None of them stood. The woman spoke first. Hadley. Her voice was the texture of crushed velvet, soft enough to feel like civility, heavy enough to carry a threat. We have been waiting for over an hour. My apologies for the delay, Vivian, Price said smoothly. He crossed to the desk at the head of the room and set his briefcase down with the composed efficiency of a man who has done this before and is not surprised by the temperature of the room. There was a necessary party who required retrieval. Vivian's eyes moved to Wren. They were ice blue, the blue of water that is very deep and very cold, and they traveled over Wren with the same cataloging attention that Wren had given the portraits in the hallway. But where Wren's inventory had been practical, Vivian's was something else. Something that found every flaw and registered it without surprise, the gaze of a woman who had expected exactly what she was looking at and was not impressed. "And who," Vivian said, her voice dropping a register, "is this? This is Wren Ashby. She is a necessary party for the reading." The young man by the window laughed. It was a short sound, not unkind in any specific way, but carrying within it the assumption that whatever had just happened was beneath serious engagement. "Is she the new housekeeping staff?" Grandfather finally replaced the last one. "Sit down, Miss Ashby," Price said. He gestured toward a chair in the corner, away from the fire, away from the three people on the leather furniture. The chair you put someone in when you want them to be present without being comfortable. "Let us begin." Wren sat, she held very still, and kept her hands in her lap and watched the room. Price withdrew a thick document from his briefcase, its seal of red wax unbroken. The crack of the seal opening carried in the silent room like a small gunshot. He began to read. There were the expected provisions, charitable bequests, instructions for the maintenance of the estate, payments to staff who had served the family for decades. The language was dense and careful. The language of a man who had spent his life understanding that words had legal weight and had tried to make every word carry exactly the weight he intended. And then Sterling Price's voice shifted. It was subtle, a slight change in register, a fractional increase in the deliberateness of his pacing. Wren noticed it. From the way Vivian's spine straightened, she noticed it too. "To my daughter, Vivian Crestwood Hale," Price read, "I leave the sum of $500,000 to be paid in a single installment upon settlement of the estate. This bequest is conditional upon her agreement in writing to make no legal contest to any other provision of this will." The silence that followed was so complete that Wren could hear the ocean faintly through the stone walls. "500,000, Vivian said. Her voice was very quiet, quieter than it had been before, which made it more frightening than if she had raised it. "That is my monthly allowance. Hadley, where is the rest of it? The company, the house, the portfolios?" Price continued as though she had not spoken. "To my grandson, Callum Hale, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles currently valued at approximately $2.3 million. The smirk left Callum's face. He sat up straight for the first time since Wren had entered the room. "Cars. He left me cars. I don't want cars. He promised me the trust fund. He said..." And finally, Price looked up from the document. He looked directly at Wren. "To my granddaughter, Wren Ashby, daughter of my beloved Sylvie." The room came apart. Vivian was on her feet before Price finished the sentence. The husband, Gideon, dropped his phone. Callum lunged forward from his chair with the reflexive movement of someone whose body has reacted before his mind has caught up. "Granddaughter." Vivian's voice had abandoned its velvet. What was underneath it was harder and colder and more honest. "Sylvie's bastard. She told us that child died. She told us the baby died with her on that road." "Miss Ashby," Price said, "is very much alive." "This is manufactured," Vivian said. She was not looking at Price. She was looking at Wren, and her ice blue eyes had narrowed to something calculating. "You produced this girl from nowhere, Hadley. You found her somewhere, coached her, brought her here. This is a fraud." "The will is properly executed and witnessed," Price replied. He said it with the boredom of a man who anticipated this response and finds it uninteresting. Its provisions are legally binding. However, there is a condition. Vivian stopped. The word condition had reached her in a way that nothing else had. She turned back to Price with her full attention, which was, Wren thought, like having a very precise instrument pointed at you. What condition? Vivian said. Price looked at Wren again. And in that moment, for just a fraction of a second, Wren saw something in his expression that she had not seen before. Something that was not the professional composure she had been reading since the foyer of Harrow House. Something that sat beneath the composure the way cold water sits beneath the surface of a lake. She could not name it precisely, but she filed it away. Mr. Crestwood was concerned. Price said that Miss Ashby might be unprepared for the responsibilities of an estate of this scale. Therefore, the will stipulates that she must reside at Crestwood Bluff for a period of 6 consecutive months. She may not leave the property for more than 24 consecutive hours at any point during this period. And during this probationary residency, Vivian Gideon and Callum Hale must be permitted to remain in residence. The words settled into the room the way rocks settle into water, with a weight that displaces everything around them. 6 months in this house with these people. If Miss Ashby fails to complete the 6-month residency, Price continued, his voice perfectly even. Or if she dies before the period concludes, the entire estate reverts to Vivian Crestwood Hale. Vivian had stopped screaming. The rage had drained from her face like water from a basin, replaced by something far more controlled, far more considered, and because of that, far more dangerous. She was looking at Wren with the focused attention of someone who has just finished calculating and has arrived at a number she finds satisfactory. She smiled. It was a thin smile, a precise smile, the smile of a woman who has just understood that the game has not ended. It has simply changed shape. 6 months, she said softly. She tilted her head very slightly to one side, the way a person tilts their head when they are considering something from a new angle. Well then, her voice had returned to velvet. Welcome to the family, little bird. We are going to have such a wonderful time together. Wren held her gaze and said nothing. She was 18 years old. She had grown up in a building where you learned very young that the people who smiled at you in a certain way were the ones you needed to watch most carefully. She recognized Vivian's smile. She had seen versions of it her entire life in smaller rooms on smaller faces with smaller stakes. This version was simply larger, more expensive, more capable of consequence. Wren noted it and moved on. They gave her a room in the east wing. It was larger than anything she had ever occupied, a 4-poster bed draped in deep blue velvet French doors, opening onto a balcony that looked out over the cliff in the gray Atlantic, far below a fireplace with a carved stone mantel, antique furniture that occupied its space with the weight of things that have not been moved in decades. By any material standard she had ever known, it was extraordinary. She stood in the center of it and thought about the chair Price had put her in during the reading. The chair in the corner, away from the fire. Sterling Price had left shortly after the reading, pressing a mobile phone into her hand as he went. My private number is programmed in, he said quietly in the manner of someone performing a reassurance. Day or night, call me if you need anything. Why are you helping me? Wren had asked. He had looked at her with those sharp, controlled eyes. He had not answered. He had left. Wren stood at the French doors of her room and looked out at the ocean. The November light was failing fast, the way it fails in Maine, in the late afternoon, not gradually but suddenly, as though the sky has made a decision and executed it without debate. The water below the cliffs was the color of hammered iron. She turned away from the window and looked at the room. It took her 3 minutes to notice the photographs. They were arranged on the dresser, the nightstand, and the shelves of a small bookcase in the corner, and they all showed the same person. A girl growing up through the photographs, the way people grow up in real life, one increment at a time, each image capturing a moment that had seemed ordinary when it was lived and had become evidence only in retrospect. Sylvie Crestwood at 5 years old on a horse that was too large for her, gripping the mane with both hands and grinning. At 10 in a school uniform on the front steps of a building that Wren did not recognize. At 15 on the very balcony where Wren had just been standing, the same Atlantic spread behind her, laughing at something beyond the frame of the camera. At 21 in a graduation gown, her face holding the particular expression of someone who is happy, but also ready to be somewhere else. In every photograph, she looked loved. In every photograph, she looked like a girl who had everything. And then she had walked out of it. She had taken nothing. She had changed her name, and disappeared into a smaller life and had never looked back. And 2 years later, her brakes had failed on a coastal road north of Portland. Wren sat on the edge of the bed and thought about all of this for a long time. Then she began to look at the room more carefully, not as a room to live in, but as a room to read. She found it behind the wardrobe. The wardrobe was tall, reaching nearly to the ceiling, positioned against the far wall, and it had clearly not been moved in years. The dust behind it was thick and undisturbed, but if you pressed yourself against the wall beside it and looked into the narrow gap between the wardrobe's back edge and the corner of the room, you could see just barely the edge of something brown and rectangular sitting on the floor. Wren moved the wardrobe 6 inches. It was heavy, but it moved. The journal was leather-bound, dark brown, its cover cracked with age in the way of things that have been held and opened many times. She pulled it out carefully as though it might come apart in her hands. It did not come apart. It had been made to last. She sat on the floor beside the wardrobe and opened it. The first entries were ordinary, the observations of a girl living a privileged and largely comfortable life, noting small dramas with the earnestness of youth. School, horses, arguments with her father about things that seemed important at 17 and would not seem important at 20. The handwriting was elegant, the loops large, the letters formed with the confidence of someone who had been taught penmanship as a social requirement and had met it. Wren turned pages. The handwriting changed. It happened gradually over the course of months of entries, the loops tightening, the letters growing smaller, more compressed, as though Sylvie were trying to put more words on each page before someone could stop her. The entries grew longer and then shorter, and then very short, single lines on some days, nothing on others. And then the final entry, dated October 2005, 19 years ago when Sylvie Crestwood was 22 years old and Wren was still 2 months away from existing. She read it slowly. I found the files in Father's study. I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for my birth certificate because the hospital needs it for the registration paperwork. But instead of my birth certificate, I found Project Leviathan. They have been dumping industrial chemicals, toxic waste material that was supposed to be disposed of through licensed facilities. Instead, they have been loading it onto Crestwood ships and taking it out to sea, the Caribbean, the Pacific. Places where the people have no political recourse and the governments do not have the resources or the inclination to investigate. I found the medical reports. Villages in the Caribbean where the fishing stock began dying in the late 1980s, and the people began getting sick in ways that no one could explain until someone started asking the right questions. Children born with conditions their parents had never seen before. Communities that had existed for generations, sustained by the sea, watching the sea turn against them, and not understanding why. 20 years of this, more. My family has been profiting from it for longer than I have been alive, I told Father. I sat in his study and I told him what I had found, and I told him I was going to the authorities. He said I would destroy everything he had built. He said I would tear the family apart. He said no one would believe me. He said a great many things, and then he stopped talking, and his face went very still in the way it goes still when he has made a decision. Then Vivian came to see me. She didn't threaten me. She is too careful for that. She sat in the chair by my window and she talked about how accidents happen, about how easy it is for something to go wrong when a person is distracted, when they are under stress, when they are not paying attention. She talked about this for perhaps 20 minutes. The whole time she was talking, her eyes were on my stomach. I understood what she was telling me. She was telling me that she knew I was pregnant. She was telling me that accidents could happen to more than one person at a time. I am leaving tonight. I am taking nothing that can connect me to this family. I am going to disappear as completely as I can, and I am going to protect my daughter from whatever this is. Father, if you ever find this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't fix what's broken here. I'm sorry I couldn't save you from yourself. But I have to protect her. I have to protect her from the secret. They will kill me if I stay. Wren sat on the floor of the room that had been her mother's room for a long time after she finished reading. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. Outside, the Atlantic moved in the darkness beyond the French doors, vast and indifferent, the same ocean it had always been. From somewhere in the west wing of the house, faintly she heard the sound of crystal against crystal, the sound of people having drinks before dinner, the sound of a household continuing to function around the fact of a death and the arrival of an inconvenience. Her mother had not abandoned her. Sylvie Ashby had run from this house at 22 years old, carrying Wren inside her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret that had eventually gotten her killed on a coastal road in 2008 when Wren was 2 years old. And now Wren was in the room her mother had run from, with the people her mother had run from, for 6 months. She closed the journal carefully. She held it against her chest with both arms the way you hold something you are not going to let go of. Then she stood up and looked at the room, the velvet curtains, the antique furniture, the photographs of her mother at every age, and the balcony where Sylvie had stood at 15, with the whole ocean behind her, laughing at something just outside the frame of a photograph taken by someone who had not yet understood what was going to be required of her. Wren was 18 years old. She had grown up with nothing in a building that had never pretended to love her, learning every day that the world did not arrange itself for the convenience of people without resources. She was standing in a house worth more than she could calculate, surrounded by people who wanted her dead, holding a leather journal that explained exactly why. She looked at the photograph of her mother at 15. The laugh, the ocean, the absolute uncalculated joy of a girl who did not yet know what was coming. Wren made a decision. She was not going to run. Running was what her mother had done, and her mother had loved her enough to run, and it had still gotten her killed on a road in Maine in 2008 when Wren was 2 years old and could not protect her. Wren was going to stay. She was going to stay, and she was going to find out everything there was to find out about what this family had done and what they were still doing and what they were planning to do to her. And when she had found all of it, she was going to make sure that not one word of it stayed buried. She slipped the journal under the mattress of the four-poster bed beside the mobile phone Price had given her, which she had no intention of using to call Sterling Price. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark ocean below the cliffs, and she thought about a girl named Sylvie Crestwood who had sat in this same room 19 years ago and looked at this same water and decided to run. She thought about how brave that had been. She thought about how it had not been enough. Then she let the curtain fall and turned back to the room, and she began to figure out what brave would have to look like now. The first week at Crestwood Bluff taught Wren 3 things. The first was that Vivian Crestwood Hale was not the kind of person who made mistakes in public. In the dining room at breakfast and dinner, she treated Wren with a courtesy so precise it could have been measured. She asked about Wren's comfort. She instructed the remaining household staff to see to her needs. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table and performed the role of a woman welcoming a difficult but ultimately manageable situation with the grace of someone who had been managing difficult situations her entire life. The performance was flawless. The eyes above it were not performing anything at all. The second thing was that Callum had not inherited his mother's patience. He followed Wren through the corridors of the house with the particular persistence of someone who wants to be noticed doing something without quite doing it. He appeared at corners. He materialized in doorways. He made comments that carried their weight in what they implied rather than what they said, remarks about how strange it must be to suddenly find yourself somewhere you clearly didn't belong, observations about how confusing large houses must be for people who weren't used to them. Each comment had an exit, a way of being dismissed as a joke if challenged. He never said anything that could be quoted back to him in a room with witnesses. The third thing was about Gideon Hale. Gideon was not like the other two. He occupied the house in the way of someone who has long since stopped trying to fill the space he's been given. At meals, he kept his eyes on his plate or his phone. In the corridors, he passed Wren without acknowledgement, not hostility, simply absence, as though his attention were perpetually located somewhere else. He was 57 years old, and he had the quality of a man who had once had more energy than he currently possessed and had been spending down the reserve for longer than he cared to calculate. But Wren noticed something about Gideon that she did not think he intended to be noticed. He watched her. Not the way Callum watched her, not with the aggressive visibility of someone performing surveillance. Gideon's watching was quieter. He would be looking at his phone, and then he would not be looking at his phone, and in the moment between the two states, his eyes would cross the room and find her with a quality of attention that was nothing like indifference. And then the phone would come back up, and he would be absent again. Wren cataloged this the way she cataloged everything. She did not reach for a conclusion yet. She waited. On the third day, she explored the library. It was the largest room she had unrestricted access to, and it was the room most likely to contain things that had been placed there deliberately rather than by accident, because people who build libraries in their private homes are usually people who understand that objects can carry information across time. She moved along the shelves, slowly reading spines. Maritime law, naval history, shipping regulations, geology of the Maine coast, collections of charts and tide tables going back decades. A man who had built his fortune on the ocean had filled his shelves with the ocean's vocabulary. She found the section of personal correspondence on the fourth shelf from the left on the east wall, bound volumes of letters organized by decade, each one labeled in a hand she recognized from the end of her mother's journal. Aldrich's handwriting. Precise, controlled the handwriting of a man who believed that how you formed a letter said something about how you formed a thought. She did not remove any of the volumes. She noted where they were and kept walking. On the third shelf from the fireplace, she found Moby Dick. It sat between a collection of maritime law precedents and a volume of New England naval history, its spine slightly more worn than its neighbors, as though it had been handled more frequently. She reached out and touched the spine without pulling it from the shelf, ran her finger along the top edge. Then she kept walking. She had not been looking for anything specific. She was simply making a map. On the fifth day, everything shifted. It was nearly midnight. Wren had been lying in the four-poster bed reading her mother's journal for the third time, looking for things she had missed in the first two readings, when she heard sounds from the kitchen below. She had learned the sound geography of Crestwood Bluff in 5 days, which floorboards spoke and which stayed silent, which pipes clanked when the heat came on, which doors had hinges that needed attention. The sounds from the kitchen were footsteps, a cabinet opening, the particular sound of a glass being taken down from a shelf. She put on her shoes and went down. The kitchen was vast and cold, designed for a household staff of 12, and currently maintained by 2 people who came in during the days and left before evening. At this hour it was dark except for the light over the stove which someone had left on, and the figure standing at the counter with a glass of water and an expression that belonged to a man in the last stages of a very long argument with himself. Gideon Hale looked up when Wren entered. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, slightly resigned, as though he had been expecting this encounter and had hoped it would not come tonight. They looked at each other across the length of the kitchen. "Don't eat the eggs tomorrow morning," Gideon said. His voice was quiet, lower than it was at the dinner table, stripped of the performance of normalcy he maintained during daylight hours. It was the voice of a man speaking in the register he actually used when no one was watching. Wren stood very still. "What?" Vivian spoke to the cook this afternoon. She asked him to add something to the scrambled eggs. Not enough to cause serious harm. His jaw tightened slightly. "Just enough to make you sick." Confused. "She wants you off balance. She works better when the people around her are off balance." Wren did not move from the doorway. She was doing what she always did when new information arrived, not reaching for it, not reacting to it, simply letting it settle into the space beside everything else she already knew and seeing what shape it made. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Gideon set the glass down on the counter. He looked at it rather than at her. The kitchen light was not kind to him. It showed the exhaustion in his face, the particular weariness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that they have forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. "Because I made a promise to your grandfather before he died," he said. "I sat beside his bed 3 weeks ago, and he made me promise that I would give you a chance. Not help you, not protect you, just give you a chance." He looked up then. He knew what Vivian would do when the will was read. He structured things the way he did because he wanted you to understand what you were walking into before you had to walk into it. Wren studied his face. He knew she would try to push me out. He knew she would try to do more than that. Gideon picked up the glass again and turned it in his hands. He spent the last year of his life understanding what kind of person his daughter had become. It took him longer than it should have. Men like your grandfather, they build things and then they fall in love with what they've built and they stop seeing clearly what it costs. He set the glass down again. He saw clearly at the end. "The book," Wren said. Gideon looked at her. "In the library, third shelf from the fireplace, Moby Dick." She watched his face. "He told you to tell me." Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not surprise, something more like recognition. "He said you'd find it on your own, most likely. He said if you hadn't found it by the end of the first week, I should point you toward it." He paused. It's been 5 days. I found it on day 3, Wren said. I was waiting to see who would mention it first. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was seeing, it seemed to confirm something he had been uncertain about. Go to the library, he said. Tomorrow afternoon when Vivian takes her calls in the West Wing. Go to the library and take down the book. He picked up his glass and walked past her out of the kitchen, his footsteps fading into the dark of the corridor beyond. Wren stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about what Aldrich had written at the end of his letter, which she had not yet read, but which she understood was waiting for her inside a hollow book on the third shelf from the fireplace. She thought about the things she had seen in Sterling Price's expression during the reading of the will that flickered beneath the professional surface, the things she had not been able to name. She thought about Gideon's voice in this kitchen, low and stripped of its daytime quality, carrying the weight of a man who was telling the truth and found it uncomfortable. She thought about her grandfather's warning, written in a letter she had not yet read, don't trust anyone, not even the people who say they are helping you survive. She thought about this specifically in relation to the man who had just warned her about the eggs and pointed her toward the book. She noted the question and went back upstairs. The following afternoon, while Vivian's voice carried from the West Wing in the precise modulations of someone conducting business with people who understood the rules of the game, Wren went to the library. She took down Moby Dick from the third shelf from the fireplace. It was lighter than it should have been for its size, and she understood why when she opened the cover. The pages had been hollowed, carved out with precision through the center of the book, creating a rectangular cavity perhaps 4 inches deep. Inside it rested 2 things, a small brass key green with age attached to a length of leather cord, and a folded piece of paper. She set the key around her neck and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Aldrich Crestwood's. Wren, if you are reading this, I am dead, and I am sorry for a great many things, most of which I cannot adequately address in a letter, but which I will try to account for in what I have left behind. I should have searched for you years ago. I should have brought you home when Sylvie died. My pride and my shame kept me from doing what was right, and you paid the price of that, and I cannot undo it. You are surrounded by people who want what I have built more than they want anything else in the world. What they have not understood is that what I built is not worth what they paid for it. Your mother found the truth about this family. It destroyed her life and ultimately her. I will not let it destroy yours. But you need to understand what you are fighting before you can fight it. In the wine cellar at the end of the furthest corridor, behind a stack of empty crates, there is a door. It was painted green once. The paint has faded. The key around your neck will open it. Inside, you will find everything you need to know about what this family has done and what it has been hiding and for how long. Trust no one, Wren, not even the people who tell you they are helping you survive. And when you are ready, burn it all down. Your grandfather, Aldrich Crestwood. Wren read the letter twice. Then she folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of her sweater close to her chest. She reshelved the hollowed book exactly as she had found it. Then she went about the rest of her afternoon as though nothing had changed. She ate dinner at the long mahogany table. She answered Vivian's courteous questions with courteous answers. She watched Callum eat with the distracted aggression of someone who has been told his inheritance has been redirected and has not yet decided what to do about it. She watched Gideon cut his food into small pieces and eat without apparent appetite, his eyes on his plate, the phone face down beside it for once. She went to bed at 10. She read for 2 hours. She set an alarm she didn't need because she had never in her life been able to sleep past 2 in the morning when something was waiting for her. At 2 o'clock, she got up. The house at this hour was a different thing from the house during the day. The staff had been gone for hours. The family was in their respective wings. The Maine Coast winter pressed against the stone walls and the high windows, and the building spoke in the language of old structures at night, the settling and contracting of materials that had been holding their shape for decades and needed the darkness to relax. Wren moved through it in her socks, pressing close to the walls where the floors were quietest, pausing at every junction to listen before she moved. She had mapped the route in her head over the past week. Kitchen, door to the lower corridor, stairs to the cellar. The cellar door was steel-heavy, fitted into the stone foundation of the house with the permanence of something that had been there since the building was constructed. She pulled it open slowly, absorbing the groan of the hinges into her body by moving the door in increments rather than in one pull. The darkness below was total. Cold air rose from it, the specific cold of underground spaces. Minerals still carrying the smell of age and stone, and the particular density of air that has not moved much in a very long time. She took the small flashlight she had found in the kitchen drawer 3 days ago and had been keeping in her pocket since and switched it on. The cellar was enormous. Stone corridors extended in 3 directions, lined with wooden racks holding wine that had been accumulating down here for decades. The flashlight beam moved across bottle after bottle, label after label, years and vineyards, and the quiet accumulation of a life lived with considerable resources. Dust covered everything uniformly. The air smelled of stone and age and something else beneath it, faint metallic. A smell she could not immediately identify. She moved deeper. The furthest corridor was the last one on the right, narrower than the others, its racks thinner, and holding bottles that looked older than the ones near the entrance. At the end of it, exactly where Aldrich's letter had placed them, stood a stack of wooden crates, empty, their slats cracked and gray with age, stacked against the far wall in a way that suggested they had not been moved in years. Wren moved the crates. They were lighter than they looked. Behind them was the door. It was iron, not steel, older than the cellar door, at the top of the stairs, fitted into the stone with a different kind of permanence. The permanence of something built in an era when things were built to outlast their builders. The surface was covered in what had once been green paint, now faded to the gray-brown of old oxidation. The lock was a simple mechanism, but a solid one built for a key that meant something. She fitted the brass key into the lock. It caught. For a moment, nothing. She gripped the key with both hands and applied pressure steadily, without forcing it, feeling for the point where the mechanism would engage. The lock turned. Something shifted inside it with a sound that echoed through the stone corridor like a small bell. The door swung inward. The room beyond was small, barely larger than the closet in her room upstairs. A single desk occupied the center, covered in files and papers stacked in the ordered way of someone who was methodical about what they were hiding. Filing cabinets lined the left wall. On the right wall, covering it almost entirely, were maps and charts, shipping routes marked in different colors, ports labeled with dates and notations in a hand she recognized as Aldrich's, the same precise handwriting as the letter in her pocket. She stepped inside. She went to the desk first. The files were organized by year. She started with the oldest, from the late 1980s, and she read quickly the way she had learned to read at Harrow House when she had limited time with library books before they needed to be returned, absorbing the essential structure of things, the shape of what was being said, the information that remained when the language around it was stripped away. The shape of what she was reading was this: for more than 30 years, Crestwood Maritime had operated 2 businesses simultaneously. The first was the one that appeared in annual reports and shipping manifests and the profiles of Aldrich Crestwood that ran in business magazines in the 1990s and 2000s, the legitimate cargo enterprise, the fleet of vessels moving goods between American ports and international markets, the respectable face of a company that had been built over decades of genuine work. The second business was Project Leviathan. The photographs were in a folder toward the bottom of the desk. She did not want to look at them. She looked at them anyway because they were evidence, and evidence had to be witnessed to have weight. Factory floors in places she recognized from the labels Central America, Southeast Asia. Men in insufficient protective gear, loading drums marked with hazard symbols onto equipment that would move them to docks where they would be loaded onto ships. Crestwood ships, she could see the hull markings in some of the photographs, the distinctive blue stripe that ran along the waterline of every vessel in the fleet. The same drums photographed again from a different angle being pushed over the sides of those ships into water that was in the photographs the deep, improbable blue of the open ocean. Caribbean waters, Pacific waters, waters that people in those places had fished for generations, had built their lives around, had handed down to their children as inheritance. Medical reports. She forced herself through them, the way you force yourself through cold water, not slowly, which makes it worse, but moving steadily, keeping going. Villages along specific coastlines where the incidence of certain conditions had increased sharply beginning in the early 1990s. Children born with neurological deficits. Adults presenting with symptoms that the local medical infrastructure was not equipped to diagnose, let alone treat. Fishing catches declining, the sea changing. The financial records told the other side of the story with the clean indifference of numbers. Millions of dollars paid by chemical companies who needed their waste to disappear and had found in Crestwood Maritime a discreet and reliable method of disappearance. Millions more moved through shell entities in jurisdictions that asked few questions, arriving eventually in accounts that the company's legitimate bookkeeping had no record of. She was nearly through the desk when she found the authorization forms. They were at the bottom of the last folder beneath the financial summaries, the operational approvals for each project, Leviathan shipment documenting who had authorized the loading of each cargo, who had approved the disposal coordinates, who had signed off on the payments from the chemical companies, the paper trail that connected the decisions to the consequences. The signatures on the authorization forms were not Aldrich's. They belonged to Vivian Crestwood Hale. 30 years of signatures. The same name in the same controlled hand, approving the same operation again and again and again across 3 decades, the signature changing slightly as the woman making it aged, but always recognizable, always there. And beneath each of Vivian's signatures, a second name. The witness, the legal confirmation that the authorization had been properly observed and recorded. Sterling Price. Wren sat back from the desk. She had known from the moment Price had looked at her in the foyer of Harrow House with the eyes of someone assessing a problem that something about him was wrong. She had known it from the way he had answers ready before she asked questions, from the way he had placed her in the corner chair during the reading from the thing beneath his professional surface that she had seen and not been able to name. She could name it now. He was not Aldrich's man. He had never been Aldrich's man. He was Vivian's, and he had been Vivian's for 30 years, and the phone he had pressed into Wren's hand in the entrance hall, with the quiet performance of an ally, was a way of knowing where she was and what she was doing and what she had found. She thought about this for one long moment. Then she kept reading. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, in a folder marked only with a date, October 2024, 3 weeks before Aldrich died, she found the medical report. It was stamped confidential and red across the top. A toxicological analysis conducted by an independent laboratory in Boston on tissue and blood samples drawn with Aldrich Crestwood's consent and knowledge. The report described elevated concentrations of a compound in his system, not at a level sufficient to cause rapid organ failure, but at a level sufficient to cause, over the course of many months, the gradual deterioration of cardiac and neurological function in a manner indistinguishable without specific testing from the natural decline of an elderly man. Her grandfather had not died of heart failure. He had been dying of something placed in his body carefully and incrementally for most of the year. And he had known it. He had commissioned this report himself 3 weeks before the end, when he no longer had the health to do anything about it except document it. The walls of the small room seemed to contract around her. Then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute in the way that only underground darkness can be absolute without the ambient glow of stars or streetlights, or the pale suggestion of a window somewhere. There was simply nothing. No gradation, no adjustment possible. Just the dark, complete and immediate, like a hand pressed over both eyes. Wren reached for her flashlight. Her fingers found it on the desk, closed around it, pressed the switch. Nothing. The battery had died. She heard the door. The iron door which she had left open when she entered was moving. She could hear it in the darkness, the slow scrape of old iron on stone, the sound of something heavy being pushed shut with deliberate care. And then the lock turning from the outside, the same small bell, sound as before but in reverse, now sealing rather than opening. The silence afterward was the worst kind of silence, the kind with intention behind it. Wren pressed both hands flat against the cold iron of the door and pushed. It did not move. She knew it would not move. She pushed anyway because the body does what the body does when it understands that it is contained. "Let me out." Her voice was even. She was surprised by this. "I know what's in this room. I know what you've done." Nothing for a moment, then footsteps on the other side of the door, not retreating, approaching. Coming to stand close to the iron, close enough that when Vivian spoke, her voice came through the metal with a clarity that suggested she was speaking directly at the surface. "You are so much like your mother," Vivian said. Her voice through the iron was soft, almost musing, the voice of someone observing something that is interesting but not surprising. Sylvie was curious too. She found this room. She read these same files. She thought she could use what she found. A pause. She was wrong about that. "You killed her." Wren kept her hands on the door, the brakes on her car. Your mother's car had faulty brakes. Vivian's tone did not change. It was a tragic accident. The investigating officers said so. The insurance adjusters said so. These things happen to young women who drive old cars on coastal roads in bad weather. And my grandfather, a longer pause. Your grandfather was going to give everything to charity, victim funds, organizations that would have used the money to build cases against this company, against this family, against everything that has been built here over 60 years. The voice through the iron was very calm. I did what was necessary to protect what we built. What you built, Ren said. Yes, Vivian said. What I built. Your grandfather put his name on it. I ran it. I made the decisions that kept it alive when the margins were thin and the competition was fierce and the regulations were tightening. I am the reason this company survived into the 21st century. And I will not have it dismantled by a girl from a charity home who has been here for 1 week. Ren pressed her forehead against the cold iron. She breathed. There is approximately 20 hours of breathable air in that room, Vivian said. Perhaps slightly less, given that you will likely panic and consume it faster. Tomorrow evening, I will come back and discover your body. The story will be that you were exploring the house on your own and accidentally locked yourself into an old storage room. Such a terrible accident. Another pause, and Ren could hear beneath the measured delivery something that was almost appreciative. You really should not have come down here alone, little bird. You should have waited for someone to help you. Footsteps, moving away from the door, fading. The particular quality of footsteps that are not coming back, and then nothing. Ren stood in the dark with her hands on the door and felt the first cold edge of panic arriving at the periphery of her mind, where panic always arrives first. Not at the center, not as a thought, but at the edges as a physical sensation, as the narrowing of the world to the immediate fact of the body and its situation. She let it arrive. She did not try to prevent it. She had learned at Harrow House in smaller emergencies than this one that trying to prevent panic was like trying to prevent weather. You could not stop it. You could only decide what you were going to do while it was happening. She stood in the dark and breathed and let the panic come and wash around her and move through her, and when it had passed the first crest, she heard something underneath it. Not a voice exactly, more like a quality of thought that felt different from her own thoughts, felt borrowed from somewhere older than her 18 years. She had survived 16 years in a building that had never pretended to love her. She had survived the social workers who lost her paperwork and the older children who took her food and the cold winters in the basement room and the years of scholarship applications written by flashlight with a pencil because she had run out of pens. She had survived every single day of a life that had not been designed with her survival in mind. She was not going to die in a room below a house she had been in for less than 2 weeks. She pushed herself off the door and turned around to face the darkness. She could not see anything. But she had been in this room for nearly an hour before the lights went out, and she had the map of it in her memory, the desk, the filing cabinets, the walls covered in charts. She began to move toward where she believed the wall of charts to be, her hands extended in front of her, moving slowly, counting steps. Her hands found paper. The wall charts. She felt along their surfaces, tracing the shapes printed on them, feeling for the one she needed. The blueprints were on the far right, she thought, the structural diagrams of the house that she had noticed and not paid close attention to because she had been focused on the operational files. She moved toward the right, feeling along the wall, and found a different texture, heavier paper, stiffer, the paper of technical drawings. She traced the lines on the blueprint with her fingertips. The cellar layout, the corridors, the rooms, and there at the edge of one drawing, a thin line running from behind the rear wall of this room to a notation she had not been able to read in the limited flashlight beam. She pressed her fingers against it now and felt what the notation indicated. A drainage channel, old pre-war, built into the foundation when the house was first constructed in 1982 on a site that required management of groundwater from the cliff face of Bluff. Running from behind the rear wall of this archive room to an outlet point on the exterior of the cliff, Ren turned toward the rear wall. She found the desk chair in the dark and dragged it behind her, using the sound of its legs on the stone floor to navigate. When she reached the rear wall, she felt it with both hands, wood paneling smooth and old, fitted tightly against the stone foundation behind it. She sat down, braced her back against the desk she had dragged to the center of the room during her search, and kicked. The wood was old and it was solid, and her feet hurt with every impact, but she kept kicking because the alternative was not kicking. She counted her strikes in her head because counting gave the mind somewhere to be besides the dark. On the 31st kick, something in the paneling gave not broke, but shifted a crack opening somewhere she couldn't see. She got up and found the crack with her hands and got her fingers into it and pulled. The wood protested with the sound of old nails releasing from old lumber, and then a section came away in her hands, and behind it was brick. Old brick, the mortar between it, soft with decades of moisture, and the constant presence of groundwater seeping through the cliff above. She found the chair leg she had been using as a brace and used it as a chisel, instead working the mortar between the bricks, scraping and pressing and pulling until the first brick came loose, and then the second, and then a third, and the cold hit her face like a physical thing. Not the mineral cold of the sealed room, but a different cold. Moving cold, the cold of outside air finding its way through stone. She worked until the opening was large enough for her shoulders. Then she got down on her stomach and she went through. The drainage channel was narrow and wet and absolutely dark and smelled of generations of groundwater and the stone and clay of the main cliff face. She moved through it on her elbows and knees, her face close to the surface of the water that ran along the bottom of it, not thinking about how narrow it was or how far she needed to go or what would happen if it ended somewhere she couldn't get through. She counted her strokes the way she had counted her kicks. She kept moving. The light when it appeared was the most important thing she had ever seen. Gray and dim and filtered through the mist that lived permanently between this cliff face and the ocean below. But light, actual light, the light of the outside world growing incrementally brighter with each stroke she took toward it. The grate was iron rusted solid into the stone at the outlet of the channel. She reached it and wrapped both hands around the bars and pushed. Nothing. She gathered everything she had left and pushed again, putting her back into it, her feet braced against the stone behind her, her shoulders driving forward. The grate broke free from one side and swung outward. Wren squeezed through the opening and found herself on a ledge of rock halfway down the face of Crestwood Bluff, 40 feet above the water, in the full darkness of a Maine coastal night, with the Atlantic crashing on the rocks below her and the mist soaking through every layer of clothing she was wearing. She pressed herself flat against the stone and breathed. She was outside. She was alive. Her hands were bleeding from the brickwork, and her knees were soaked, and her face was close enough to the cliff face that she could smell the stone and the salt and the old iron of the grate she had broken. She looked up. The cliff face above her was wet and dark, striped with the water that ran constantly from the land above. The same water that had kept the drainage channel working for 40 years. There were holes in the rock irregular, not designed for climbing, but present the natural articulation of stone that has been weathering for longer than the house above it has been standing. Wren began to climb. She did not think about the drop below her. She thought about the next hold, and then the one after that, and then the one after that, moving up the face of the cliff in the dark with bleeding hands, and the sound of the ocean below growing slightly more distant with each foot she gained. Twice her feet slipped, and she hung by her hands for a moment that felt much longer than it was before finding purchase again. Both times she kept moving. When she pulled herself over the top of the cliff and onto the lawn behind Crestwood Bluff, she lay on her back on the cold grass for exactly 30 seconds, staring up at the overcast sky. Then she sat up. The house loomed above her, its dark windows watching the way they had always watched, the chimneys reaching into the mist. Most of the windows were black. In the west wing, a few lights still burned Vivienne's quarters. She knew where a woman who had just left someone to die underground was likely sleeping with the uncomplicated sleep of someone who believed they had managed the situation effectively. On the far edge of the property, barely visible through the mist, was the small light in the window of the caretaker's cottage. Wren looked at it. She had seen the caretaker during her first week, an older man, broad-shouldered, quiet, who tended the grounds with the systematic attention of someone who took maintenance seriously. She had noted him the way she noted everyone at Crestwood Bluff and had filed him without conclusion because she had not yet had reason to reach a conclusion about him. She had reason now. She had no other options, and she had learned very young that when you had no other options, you moved toward the available light. She got to her feet. She crossed the lawn in the dark, staying low, moving from shadow to shadow, the way she had moved through Harrow House at night when she needed to get somewhere without being seen. The cottage was 200 yards from the main house. She covered it in the dark and without making a sound. She knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately. The man standing in the doorway was not quite what she had observed from a distance during the past week. Up close in the warm light of the cottage interior, the quality she had read as ordinary caretaker efficiency revealed itself as something more considered, more deliberate. The gray hair was cut short in a way that suggested habit rather than convenience. The eyes that moved over her, taking in the bleeding hands, the soaked clothing, the position she had just climbed out of a cliff face to arrive at, did not show surprise. They showed assessment, rapid and thorough, the assessment of someone who has been trained to evaluate situations quickly and has done it so many times that it has become the resting state of their attention. "I wondered how long it would take you to find your way here," he said. "Who are you?" Wren asked. "Declan Mace," he said. "Your grandfather hired me in February. Come inside. We have work to do." The cottage was small and warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something else underneath the particular orderliness of a space inhabited by someone who had spent decades in environments where disorder had consequences. Every surface was clear. Every object had a place. On the desk against the far wall, maps and documents were arranged in overlapping layers that looked chaotic until you looked at them longer and understood they were organized by a logic that simply wasn't immediately visible. Declan Mace closed the door behind her and moved to the kitchen without being asked, filling a mug from the coffee pot that had clearly been kept warm throughout the night. He set it on the table in front of her and sat down across from it and looked at her hands. "There's a first aid kit in the cabinet above the sink," he said. "I'm fine. Your hands are bleeding onto my table." Wren looked down. He was right. She wrapped both hands around the mug instead, using the pressure to slow the bleeding, and looked at Declan Mace across the table with the full attention she had been trained by 16 years of necessary vigilance to apply to situations she didn't yet understand. He was in his late 40s, she decided upon closer inspection than the distance of the past week had allowed. The breadth of his shoulders was not bulk, but structure, the kind of physical development that comes from sustained functional training rather than any aesthetic ambition. His face was weathered in a specific way, weathered by exposure rather than age, the face of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors in conditions that were not designed for comfort. The stillness in how he held himself was not the stillness of a calm person. It was the stillness of a person who had learned to conserve movement because movement had once had tactical implications. "You were a Navy SEAL," Wren said. Something crossed his face, not surprise again, not surprise, but something that might have been the faintest edge of approval. 22 years, he said, then private security work for another 8. Executive protection, high-risk extractions, the kind of work where the client doesn't want it discussed afterward. "And my grandfather hired you." "In February. He came to me through a referral from someone who had used my services and trusted my discretion. He told me he was dying. He had known for several months that he was dying. Not from the heart condition his doctors had been monitoring, but from something else, something that was being introduced deliberately, and he had begun to understand who was responsible." Declan turned his own mug in his hands. He couldn't prove it yet. He needed time to build the documentation. And he needed someone to make sure you were still alive when the time came to use it. Wren thought about the 9 months between February and November. 9 months of Declan Mace on the grounds of Crestwood Bluff, maintaining the property. Watching the house, watching Vivian, watching the road for the black Mercedes that eventually came for an 18-year-old girl in a charity dress with bleeding hands and a rubber band in her hair. "You were watching me before I arrived," she said, "from the day Price went to Portland. I needed to know whether you were being followed, whether Vivian had someone on you before you even reached the house." She didn't. She was confident enough in the will structure that she believed she had time with this. He paused. She was almost right. "Why didn't you intervene tonight in the cellar?" Declan held her gaze steadily. "Because your grandfather believed that if you were going to win this, you needed to understand it completely before you faced it directly. If I had pulled you out of that room before you read everything in it, you would have had a partial picture. A partial picture is dangerous. It makes you confident in the wrong places." He set down his mug. "I was monitoring. If you hadn't found the drainage outlet within 4 hours, I was coming through the door regardless." 4 hours, Wren said. "You did it in less than 2. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the desk against the wall, at the maps and documents arranged in their deliberate layers. "Tell me about the safe." Declan didn't ask how she knew about a safe. He had assessed her in the first 30 seconds of her arrival and had arrived at conclusions that apparently included the conclusion that she was not someone who needed to be managed toward information gradually. Your grandfather's bedroom. East wall behind the painting of the ship in the Storm Maritime scene oils in a gilt frame. The safe behind it has a biometric scanner as the primary lock. But 3 months before he died, Aldrich added a secondary numeric code as a backup. He set it himself without telling Price using the facility on the safe's manufacturer app on a phone he purchased in cash in Augusta and never connected to his home network. Declan looked at her. The code is your birthday. Month, day, year, 6 digits. What's in it? A voice recorder. Silver about the size of a cigarette lighter. Your grandfather carried it with him for the last 6 months of his life. Every meeting he had with Vivian, every conversation, every phone call he was present for them that involved her making decisions about the company or about you or about what was going to happen after he died, he recorded it. Wren was very still. There are recordings of conversations in which Vivian discusses the mechanism of his poisoning with Price. Recordings of her authorizing the continuation of Project Leviathan after he told her he was shutting it down. Recordings of her discussing what she intended to do about the will and about you. He paused. Recordings of her telling Price that Sylvie Ashby's brake failure had been arranged. The warmth of the cottage and the coffee and the wood smoke seemed to recede slightly, not physically, but in the way that warmth recedes when something cold and true arrives and takes up space. She said it on a recording, Wren said. She said it to a dying man she believed was no longer a threat to her. People say things to dying men they believe are no longer threats. Declan's voice was even. Your grandfather understood this about her. He used it. The PA system, Wren said. She had noticed it in her first exploration of the house speakers in every room, an old-fashioned audio distribution system of the kind installed in large houses in the 1990s, when the technology was new enough to seem impressive and old enough now to seem merely functional. Aldrich had it modified in August. The modification runs the system's output through a secondary transmitter that broadcasts on the main state police emergency frequency. Any audio played through the house PA is simultaneously transmitted to every state police dispatch unit within 50 miles. He built it himself, Wren said. Not a question. He had help from a contractor in Bangor who understood that some work is paid for in cash and not discussed. The contractor believed he was installing a wildlife monitoring system. Declan looked at her. Your grandfather was a man who had spent 60 years building things that worked the way he needed them to work. At the end, he applied that skill to the only project that mattered. Wren looked at her hands wrapped around the mug. The bleeding had slowed. The cuts from the brickwork were not deep. They were the cuts of hard work done in urgency, and they would heal. I need to go into the house, she said. Yes, tonight. The longer we wait, the more likely Vivienne checks the room and finds you gone. Once she knows you're out, she changes her approach. We lose the element of her believing she controls the timeline. Wren nodded. You'll come with me. To the bedroom, yes. After that, he looked at her with an expression that was serious and direct and without apology. After that, it's yours. I can stand in the hallway. I can watch your back. But the recorder comes out of that safe by your hands and the play button gets pressed by your finger. This is your story, Wren, not mine. I'm here because your grandfather asked me to give you the chance to finish it. The finishing has to be yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up from the table. Get your coat, she said. They moved through the dark of the estate grounds like two different kinds of quiet Declans. The quiet of formal training, economical and deliberate, and Wren's the quiet she had built from 16 years of moving through spaces where she was not entirely welcome and had learned to take up as little sonic space as possible. They reached the servants' entrance at the rear of the house's east wing, a door that Declan had a key for, and went in. The interior of the house at 3 in the morning was a different architecture than the one Wren had been navigating for a week. The staff corridors narrower than the main passages and running behind them like a second circulation system, built for invisibility, absorbed their footsteps in the particular way of floors that had been walked by people who needed to be silent as a professional requirement. Declan moved with the map of the house in his body, turning without hesitation, pausing at junctions with the brief precision of someone checking variables rather than remembering directions. The staircase from the servants' corridor emerged at the second-floor landing 20 feet from the door to Aldrich Crestwood's bedroom. The bedroom door still wore the yellow tape of the police investigation, a single strip across the frame, placed there by the officers who had responded to the report of a natural death and had processed it in the cursory way that natural deaths in houses belonging to wealthy elderly men are processed when nothing on the surface requires further examination. Declan cut the tape with a knife drawn from his jacket and eased the door open, by degrees monitoring each point of resistance in the hinges, keeping the sound below the threshold of audibility. The room beyond smelled of old medicine and the particular quality of air in a space that has been closed since the person who inhabited it stopped breathing. The bed had been stripped, mattress bare, pillows, removed, the furniture of illness cleared away, as though the physical evidence of Aldrich's last months were something to be efficiently managed rather than mourned. Heavy curtains kept the room in absolute darkness. Declan stepped to one side of the door and held position there, facing back toward the corridor. Wren moved into the room. She did not use a light. She had the layout in her memory from a single careful pass during her first-week exploration of the house, when she had opened every door that wasn't locked and cataloged every room in the systematic way she cataloged everything. East wall, painting in a gilt frame, maritime scene ship in a storm. Her hands found the frame in the dark. She lifted it away from the wall, feeling the weight of it shift, and set it carefully against the baseboard. The safe was there, recessed into the wall at chest height, its face a combination of smooth metal and the small circular panel of the biometric scanner. Beside the biometric panel, the numeric keypad. She pressed 6 digits. Her birthday. Month, day, year, the date that Sylvie Ashby had chosen for her before Sylvie Ashby understood what that date would cost. The safe beeped once. The lock disengaged with a sound like a small, decisive breath, and the door swung open. Inside, resting on the velvet-lined interior, was a silver voice recorder. Beside it, a velvet pouch that shifted and clinked softly when she picked it up. Jewelry, she guessed something Aldrich had wanted preserved rather than distributed through the estate. She took the recorder and left the pouch where it was. She turned toward the door. Gideon Hale was standing in it, not in the doorway in the room, 2 steps inside, which meant he had entered while she was at the safe in the dark without her hearing him. Wren registered this with the part of her mind that was always making assessments, and understood that it meant he had been waiting, not following her, not stumbling across her, but positioned and waiting, which meant he had known she would be here at this approximate time, which meant he had known or guessed at enough of the plan to predict her. He was wearing a dark overcoat over his pajamas. His silver hair was disheveled. In the dim light that crept around the edges of the curtains, his expression held something she had not seen on his face before. Not the calculated neutrality of the dinner table, not the performed distance of a man in a house he has stopped trying to belong to, but something active and alert and entirely without the quality of a man who had come to this room by accident. "I knew you would come here eventually," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had changed. The exhaustion was gone from it. What was underneath the exhaustion, now that the performance of it had been set aside, was something more precise, more intentional. "I told Vivian you were too stubborn to die quietly in that room." Behind him in the corridor, Wren heard the sound of something heavy shifting, followed by a silence that was wrong, the silence of a space that had contained 2 people and now contained 1. Declan. She kept her face still. "Vivian's man came up the servants' stair," Gideon said as though reading her thought. "Your protector is in the corridor. He's alive. He'll remain that way as long as this conversation goes well." He tilted his head slightly. "I need you to understand that I came very close in the past week to genuinely helping you. That cracks me open a little, that understanding. I warned you about the eggs because I needed you to trust me. I sent you to the book because I needed you to trust me. The trust was the objective. The rest of it was methodology." "You're not on any side," Wren said. "I'm on the side that wins." He said it without shame, which was somehow more honest than shame would have been. "I've been married to Vivian Crestwood Hale for 22 years. I know exactly what she is. I also know that knowing what she is has never been protection against her, because knowing and being able to act on knowledge are different capacities, and she has spent 22 years ensuring I had only one of them." He looked at the recorder in Wren's hand. She wanted you dead immediately. I convinced her to wait. I told her people make mistakes when they're desperate and that you were more useful as a guided discovery than as an immediate problem. I told her you'd lead us to whatever Aldrich had hidden. He paused. I was right. From behind him, Vivian stepped into the doorway. She was wearing a black silk robe, her hair loose for the first time Wren had seen it, not softening her, but revealing a different quality of hardness, the hardness of a face that didn't need its armor because it had never required it in the first place. She held the pearl-handled pistol at her side, not raised yet, with the ease of someone who is comfortable with what they are holding. And behind Vivian Sterling Price, still in his suit, Wren had a brief, dislocated thought that she had never seen him in anything else, that perhaps the suit was permanent structural, a second skin grown over the years until it could not be removed. Three of them, between them and the door, the recorder in her hand, the PA console in the library 2 floors below. Vivian raised the pistol. "Give me the recorder," she said, "and we can have a conversation about your options." Wren did not move. She looked at the recorder in her hand. She thought about $5 million, the number Price had floated in Gideon's direction or would float. She could see it assembling itself in the architecture of what was happening in this room, the offer of a clean exit, a manageable loss, a life somewhere else on someone else's terms. She thought about what that life would look like. Safe, quiet, built on the decision to let a dead woman stay buried and a living family go on operating in the dark. She looked up at the painting that she had set against the baseboard, the ship in the storm, one Aldrich had hung above his safe, the one he had looked at from his bed in the last months of his life as he built the case against his own daughter, one recorded conversation at a time. The ship was not sinking in the painting. It was fighting. The sea was tremendous, and the sky was violent, and the ship was simply refusing to be done. She looked at Vivian. "If you shoot me," Wren said, "my hand closes on this recorder when I fall. It doesn't break. It's built for field use. I looked at the model number when I took it out of the safe, and I know what it is because I spend a lot of time in libraries and I read about things I find. The fall won't damage it. And when whoever finds my body also finds a silver recorder clutched in my hand, in your father's bedroom the night after he was buried, someone is going to press play." Vivian's expression did not change. "I'll take the recorder before anyone finds you," she said. "Will you?" Wren looked at Gideon, then at Price. "The 4 of us are in this room right now. 3 of you know every specific detail of what is on that recording. If I die tonight, you need all 3 of those people to stay silent indefinitely. Indefinitely is a long time." She let the silence sit. "My grandfather built this company by understanding that the weakest point in any structure is the joint, the place where 2 things meet, the place where the interests of one party are not perfectly aligned with the interests of another." She looked at Gideon. "How perfectly aligned are your interests right now with Vivian's?" Gideon and Price looked at each other. It lasted 1 second, perhaps less. But it was a look that contained a conversation, and the conversation was the one Wren had named, and Vivian saw it happen. Wren watched Vivian's eyes move between them and watched the calculation occurring behind those ice-blue eyes. The rapid practice calculation of a woman who had been reading rooms and managing alliances for 30 years, and who had just understood that the room had shifted. The pistol lowered 3 inches. Only 3 inches. But 3 inches was enough. Wren ran, past Gideon, who moved to stop her, and was a fraction of a second behind the decision. Through the doorway, past Price, whose hand caught the sleeve of her jacket and then lost it. Into the corridor where Declan was on the floor with a cut above his temple, and his eyes open, tracking her as she came through, already moving to get up with the deliberate economy of someone managing an injury without being stopped by it. Down the corridor, the main staircase. She did not look back because looking back was not information she needed, and it would cost her speed. The library was on the ground floor east wing, and she had walked the route from the main staircase to the library door so many times in the past week that her body knew it without her having to think about it. She hit the library doors at a run and went through them into the room that smelled of old leather and fireplace ash, and the accumulated paper of a life spent in proximity to the sea. The audio console was on the desk. She had spent 2 days examining it during her first week exploration, the old-fashioned distribution board that Aldrich had installed in the 1990s and had never replaced because it worked, and he did not replace things that worked. The input jack for an external audio source was on the left side of the board. She had noted it. She had noted everything. She crossed the room in 5 strides and jammed the recorder's output jack into the console's input and reached for the volume control and turned it to its maximum position and found the broadcast switch that Aldrich's contractor in Bangor had installed in August, labeled simply with a small strip of tape on which someone had written the word transmit in ballpoint pen. The library door burst open. Vivian came through them with the pistol, raised her silk robe, catching the air of her movement, her face holding an expression that had moved past calculation into something raw and more fundamental, the expression of someone who has built their entire life on a particular outcome and can see the outcome changing. "Step away from that console," she said. Wren's hand hovered over the play button. "If you shoot me," Wren said, "I fall forward. The button gets pressed. I will destroy the console before it finishes." "The transmitter is already active," Wren said. She nodded toward the small indicator light on the transmit switch, which glowed a steady amber the moment it was engaged, which she had known it would because she had read the contractor's installation notes that Aldrich had filed in the 3rd drawer of the desk she was standing at. "The moment I press play, the audio goes out on the state police emergency frequency simultaneously. You can destroy the console. You cannot destroy the frequency." Vivian stared at her. In 30 years, Wren thought she had never been in a room where she did not control the outcome. She had built that control methodically over decades using intelligence and patience and a willingness to do the things that other people considered unthinkable. She had been very good at it. She was in the objective assessment that Wren had been applying to her since the moment she entered the library, an extraordinarily capable person who had directed her capacity entirely toward the wrong ends. But she had never been in a room with a girl who had grown up with nothing, who had learned in a building in Portland that the world did not arrange itself for you, and that if you needed something, you needed to build it yourself, and who had spent the past week in this house, reading it the way she read everything completely, without assumption, looking for the structure beneath the surface. "You can't do this," Vivian said. Her voice had changed. Not broken, she was not a woman who broke, but shifted, moved from its habitual register into something less composed. "You don't understand what you would be destroying. This company employs thousands of people. The Crestwood name is in this community, in this state. You would tear down something that took 60 years to build." "Your father built it," Wren said. "You used it. I kept it alive. I made the decisions no one else was willing to make. I did what was necessary." "You killed my mother," Wren said. She was 24 years old. She had done nothing except find the truth and decide to tell it. And you had someone tamper with her brakes on a road north of Portland in 2008. And my grandfather spent 16 years not looking for me because he was ashamed of what his family had become. And I grew up in a building on a cot wedged between a water heater and a stack of donated mattresses, writing scholarship applications by flashlight. She kept her voice level. She had learned very young that level voices carry farther than raised ones. "I am not going to let that be the end of the story." She pressed play. Aldrich Crestwood's voice filled the library, older than she had expected, frailer, but steady in the way of things that had been held together through will rather than health. She heard it for the first time as it played through the speakers of his own house, through the walls of the home he had built, and the rooms where his daughter had made her decisions, out into the November night of the Maine coast, and simultaneously across the emergency frequency of the state police into every dispatch unit within 50 miles. She heard him say, "Vivian, we need to talk about what's being done. The company, the ships, the people who are getting sick." She heard Vivian answer, "We have talked about it, Father. We've talked about it for 2 years. The answer hasn't changed." She heard Aldrich say, "I'm going to the authorities. I'm going to tell them everything." She heard Vivian say, "No, you're not." She heard the recording continue the full conversation, and the ones that followed, weeks of them, the slow, patient construction of a case built by a dying man who understood that the only weapon he had left was the truth, and who had spent the last months of his life making sure the truth was recorded, preserved, and placed where the right person could find it. She heard herself described. "A girl your father apparently located. She won't be a problem for long." She heard Price's voice answer, "How long do you need?" she heard Vivian say. 6 months at most. The will takes care of itself. She heard things she would carry for the rest of her life, and she stood at the console with her hand on the volume and listened to every word because the words were evidence, and evidence had to be witnessed to have weight. And because her grandfather had recorded them for her, specifically for this moment, for the girl he had never met but had believed in enough to build a trap for his own daughter around the certainty of her survival. Behind her, she heard Vivian lower the pistol. Not set it down. Lower it. The sound of a woman who has not surrendered, but who has encountered the limits of what force can accomplish against something that has already been set in motion. The sirens started 17 minutes into the recording. Not one. Multiple, the layered progression of several vehicles moving at speed along the coastal road north of Ashford, growing louder in the way that sound grows louder when it is coming for you, specifically rather than merely passing. Through the library windows across the dark grounds of Crestwood Bluff, lights appeared at the gate, red and blue strobing through the November mist. The window nearest the desk exploded inward as the entry team came through it, which was dramatic and unnecessary, but was apparently how the Maine State Police preferred to enter houses in which multiple felonies were in progress. Wren stepped back from the console and put her hands where they could be seen, and said her name clearly, and watched the room fill with people who were not Vivian, and were not Price, and were not Gideon Hale. Vivian was handcuffed near the fireplace, the pearl-handled pistol removed from her hand with professional efficiency by an officer who did not appear impressed by its aesthetic qualities. Her face in the moment the handcuffs closed was unreadable. Not the cold control of the dining room performances, not the raw register of the library confrontation, but something between them. Something that was the face of a woman who has been very good at a very long game and has finally played past the edge of the board. Price was already in custody in the corridor outside the library, where Declan, blood drying at his temple and his expression professionally neutral, had been holding him against the wall since the sound of the sirens reached the second floor. Gideon Hale was found in the entrance hall, seated on a chair beneath the portraits of his wife's ancestors, his overcoat still on, and his hands folded in his lap, waiting with the air of a man who had calculated his options and arrived at the conclusion that cooperation was the most advantageous of them. Callum was in his room. When the officers came through his door, he was sitting on the floor with his back against the bed, his eyes not quite focused, the remains of a bottle of his grandfather's single malt on the nightstand beside him. When they told him what was happening, he asked one question. "Did she lose?" he said. "Not my mother. She." "Yes," one of the officers said. Callum nodded slowly as though this confirmed a calculation he had been running for a long time. "Then I've lost," he said. "I was always going to end up wherever she ended up. I just didn't know if it would be here or there." He held out his wrists. The state police captain found Wren at the library window watching the last of the arriving vehicles come through the estate gate. He was a compact man in his 50s with the face of someone who had been doing a difficult job for long enough that difficulty no longer registered as remarkable. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Wren Ashby." "Yes, we received the audio transmission beginning at 3:42 this morning. We had units en route within 6 minutes." He paused. "We also received a package in October from Aldrich Crestwood via a law firm in Boston that is not Price and Harmon. Extensive documentation of Project Leviathan financial records, the toxicology report on Mr. Crestwood himself. We had opened a parallel investigation." He looked at her with the directness of a man who respected information delivered plainly. Tonight was the closing of it. Wren thought about her grandfather in his final months, sitting in rooms in this house with a recording device in his pocket and the knowledge of what was being done to him, building case after case, filing copies in Boston, hiding evidence in hollow books, modifying PA systems through contractors in Bangor paid in cash. A man who had done terrible things and had spent his last year trying to undo as many of them as he could reach from a dying body. "He made sure it would work even if I didn't," she said. "Yes," the captain said, "he did." A pause. "But you were the one who pressed play." 6 months later, Vivian Crestwood Hale stood in a courtroom in Augusta and heard herself described in the language of a jury's verdict. It was a language stripped of all the velvet and calculation she had deployed across 50 years of managing how she was perceived, plain, declarative, impossible to negotiate with. On the count of murder in the first degree, in the death of Aldrich Crestwood. Guilty on the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Sylvie Ashby. Guilty on the count of racketeering in connection with the operation known as Project Leviathan. Guilty on all 37 counts. She stood very straight while the verdicts were read. Wren watched her from across the courtroom and understood that this too was performance that Vivian Crestwood Hale would perform composure until there was no audience left to perform for and possibly after. Some people were made entirely of their surfaces. What was underneath was only more surface. The judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. Sterling Price had entered a guilty plea in March to avoid trial, accepting 25 years. He would be in his 80s before any release was possible. He had made a brief statement before the plea was accepted in which he described himself as a man who had allowed professional loyalty to become something else over time, and he was sorry for the harm that had resulted. The statement had been written by his new attorney. The captain from the state police had told Wren privately that he didn't think Price was sorry for anything except the outcome. Gideon Hale had cooperated fully with the prosecution, providing testimony about the internal operations of Project Leviathan and the specific mechanisms of Aldrich's poisoning that had corroborated and extended the documentary record. His cooperation had earned him a reduced sentence of 10 years. There were people who found this too lenient. Wren was one of them, and she had made her view known to the prosecutor, and then she had accepted that justice in practice was different from justice in principle, and moved on because moving on was what you did when you had limited time and a great deal of work to do. Callum Hale was remanded to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and ongoing treatment. The assessment had found a man who had never developed any identity independent of his mother's ambitions, and who was, in the terminology of the report, severely compromised in his capacity for autonomous functioning. The doctor said he would be there for a long time. He did not contest this. Wren read the reports, all of them, as they arrived through the legal process. She kept them in a file in the office she had established at Crestwood, Bluff, in the room that had once been Aldrich's study at the desk, where he had kept letters and charts in the evidence of a life built on the ocean. She kept them because they were the official account, and official accounts mattered, and she had learned from a hollow book in an underground room and a drainage channel through a cliff face that the evidence you preserve is the evidence that survives. In the spring, she established the Crestwood Ocean Trust. $500 million transferred from the estate before the remaining assets were distributed according to the restructured will. The trust's mandate was explicit and extensive environmental remediation of the marine areas affected by Project Leviathan's dumping operations, beginning with the sites that the documentary record had identified as the most severely impacted. Medical assistance and compensation for the communities whose health had been damaged by decades of toxic exposure. Research partnerships with universities in 3 countries studying the long-term ecological consequences of chemical contamination in open ocean environments. The launch of the trust generated news coverage that Wren had not anticipated and found uncomfortable because the coverage was about her rather than about the work, and the work was the point. She did a single interview with a journalist from the Boston Globe who had covered the trial and whom she had found to be careful and accurate in her reporting, and she said what she needed to say, and she did not do another one. What she said was, "My family made a great deal of money by destroying things that could not be replaced. We cannot replace them, but we can stop pretending that what was done was acceptable, and we can spend what we made on trying to do better, and we can do this for as long as it takes and then longer." In June, she went back to Harrow House. She had called Mrs. Voss in April and told her what she was planning, and Mrs. Voss had cried, which Wren had not expected, and which had required her to sit with the phone pressed against her ear in Aldrich's study for several minutes without saying anything while Mrs. Voss composed herself. The building was purchased through a trust established for the purpose. The renovation took 8 weeks. Private rooms replaced the dormitory arrangements. A kitchen that was designed to feel like a home kitchen rather than an institutional one. A library stocked with books chosen by a children's librarian in Portland who took the commission seriously and delivered a collection that Wren walked through for 2 hours the day it was installed, running her fingers along the spines. A computer lab, a garden, a counseling suite, a room designated for college application support, where someone would sit with the residents and help them fill out the forms and write the essays and understand that the future they were trying to reach was not theoretical. The sign above the entrance read, the Sylvie Ashby Home for Children. Mrs. Voss stood beside Wren on the day it opened, looking up at the sign with the expression of a woman who has worked in an imperfect system for a long time and has unexpectedly been shown what it might look like if it worked better. "You're not the same girl who left here," she said. "No," Wren said, "I'm not. She would be very proud of you, your mother." Wren looked at the sign for a long moment, at the name she had known only as a record in a file, and a face in a photograph, and handwriting in a leather journal that had been hidden behind a wardrobe for 18 years. "I don't know," she said. "I think she'd have opinions about some of the decisions I made along the way." Mrs. Voss made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Mothers usually do." Autumn came to the Maine coast in the way it always came, suddenly, definitively. The trees making their annual announcement that they had been holding something back all summer and were now prepared to show it. The maples along the drive at Crestwood Bluff went first, then the oaks, then the birches at the property's edge, the whole progression happening over 10 days in early October, until the view from the cliff was a thing you could not look at without feeling something. Wren stood on the cliff behind the house on an evening in the third week of October, watching the light leave the water. It left slowly at this time of year, the sun taking its time about the horizon as though reconsidering. The Atlantic below the cliff was dark at its depth and copper at its surface, and entirely indifferent to the fact of being observed, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about it. Declan Mace came to stand beside her. He had stayed on after November, not because she had asked him to. She had not asked him to do anything except be honest with her, which she had requested in the cottage on the night they first spoke, and which he had honored without making a performance of it. He had stayed because the work of the trust required people who understood logistics and security and the management of operations in difficult conditions, and he was very good at all of these things, and he had found, apparently, that he was not done being useful. "The environmental team filed their first quarterly report," he said. "I read it. The remediation in the first Caribbean site is showing results faster than the scientists projected. Something about the current patterns in that area, the water movement, is helping disperse the treatment compounds." "I read that part too." Wren looked at the horizon. "There's a community there, a fishing village. Their catch is up 12% from last year." Declan was quiet for a moment. "That's good news." "Yes," she paused. "It doesn't undo 20 years, but it's good news." They stood in the falling light for a while without speaking. The wind off the Atlantic was cold in the specific way of the Maine coast in October. Not the dry cold of inland autumn, but something with salt in it, something that reminded you that the cold had traveled a long way to reach you. "What are you going to do?" Declan asked. Not meaning tomorrow or next month, meaning the larger question. Wren thought about the college applications that were currently sitting on Aldrich's desk in the study, submitted, acknowledged, waiting for responses. Environmental law at 3 universities that had strong programs and had agreed to consider her application on its academic merits rather than on the basis of the name Crestwood, which she had specifically requested. She thought about what she wanted to do with a law degree applied to what she now understood about the world, the mechanisms that allowed companies to do what Crestwood Maritime had done, the legal architectures that made it possible to build profit on the suffering of people who did not have the resources to fight back. "I'm going to learn how to close the doors my family walked through," she said, "and then I'm going to spend the rest of my life closing them." Declan nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who considers this an adequate plan. Wren reached into her jacket pocket and took out 2 photographs. She had been carrying them both since the day she retrieved them from the room that had been her mother's, the one she had carried for 16 years, and the one she had found among Aldrich's belongings after the trial taken in his final months by someone who had caught him unaware, sitting at his desk, with his face turned toward a window and his expression holding the particular quality of a man thinking about something he cannot fix. She looked at them both in the failing light. Her mother at 20 on this cliff laughing, her grandfather at the end looking towards something she couldn't see from where she stood. She put them back in her pocket close to where her heart was and turned away from the ocean. The house waited behind her, its stone walls gone amber in the last light, its windows reflecting the dying colors of the sky. Somewhere inside it, in the rooms and corridors and the library where the truth had finally been played out loud, the work of the next thing was already waiting to begin. She walked toward it. She was 18 years old, and she had nothing except the truth and everything that could be built from it, and she had learned that this was when you thought about it carefully enough.